Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana, and we're here today with special guest, Paul Rushworth-Brown, who's here to share with us his new novel, Outback Odyssey. So what happens when a nation builds its future on stories it hasn't fully faced? Well, our guest today is joining us from Australia to dive into just that. Paul Rushworth-Brown is an Australian historical novelist whose work explores moral consequence, inherited silence, and the human cost of policy and power. His novel, Outback Odyssey, examines how ordinary individuals are shaped, and sometimes compromised, by the historical forces they enter. His writings invite readers into the complexity of memory, migration, and belonging within 20th century Australia. So welcome to the show, Paul Rushworth-Brown.
Oh, thanks, Marianne. Great to be here.
Well, what a great honor it is to have you here and to talk about not just the book that you've written, but the work behind it. What was the catalyst for writing Outback Odyssey?
The real catalyst wasn't history. It's basically a question about what happens when the stories someone is promising turns out to be incomplete. So the stories about history are usually written by those in power, and quite often they tend to leave things out of that particular history. So the catalyst was to, I suppose, all my writing tends to give people that don't have a voice a say, whether that be First Nations people in Australia or peasants living on the moors of Yorkshire back in the 16th century. Quite often, there's a lot of history about those particular people, peasants, that people don't know because history was written by lords and ladies.
Yeah, there's so much that once we start diving into history, understanding what has happened to the people that are living during that time sometimes is very shocking. So, how do you think historical upheaval has shaped the moral choices of entire generations?
I don't think it's not a backdrop, it's pressure. And the moral choices shaped by what's demanded of those people. What they have to endure, what they must, I suppose, what they're forced to comply with, and what they manage to resist.
So, when you were doing your research, can you share an example of what history exerting its pressure on personal choices would look like?
Sure, like for instance, with Outback Odyssey, there was a referendum in Australia in 2023, and that referendum was set up basically to give First Nations people a say in their own sort of like development and be part of the Australian Constitution. So the referendum was knocked back, and there's been a number of times through Australian history where First Nations people have been silenced. Not having a say in the Constitution is one example. Not being allowed to vote until sort of like the 1970s is another example. And these types of, issues continue to rise.
So, can you share with us the backdrop of Outback Odyssey, the time that it took place, and just give us a little bit of an idea of the story?
Okay, so it's actually allegorical. So, in other words, it's set in 1950s Australia, and on the top level, it's an adventure, romance set in the outback, and it's about a young English immigrant that goes to Australia under the £10 POM scheme, which was a scheme set up by the Australian government to bring British people to Australia to live, to work, and all they had to do was to get there was to pay the Australian government £10, and part of that was because they wanted to keep Australia British. And so Jimmy, the protagonist, he travels to Australia, and because he spent most of his life in an orphanage because his parents died when he was very young. He doesn't feel like he belongs anywhere. He doesn't feel like he belongs in England. He's come to this huge country to 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 live and to improve his life. And he soon finds out that he feels like he doesn't belong there either. And he's sent out to a sheep station out in the outback Victoria, and works with First Nations stockmen. But allegorically, Jimmy is actually, I suppose, the moral engine of the story. It basically holds up a mirror to people, to not necessarily just Australian people, but all people where the country has been colonized by another power. And I mean, it doesn't preach, but what it does, Jimmy being the moral compass, he's actually taken under the wing of an Aboriginal elder, and that elder teaches him the wisdom of First Nations culture, and I suppose and how important the land is, and eventually he's taken in by that Australian mob or clan, so to speak, and through that, it brings out, I suppose, some of the issues that First Nations people have faced over the years with regard to bigotry and racism and that type of thing.
So, is there a cost when a culture or a nation stays silent and complicit when it comes to um, times of cultural change?
Definitely. Look, when that silence occurs, then that silence becomes the inheritance of the next generation. I mean, today I'm a teacher by day, and the lost generations or the First Nations people that were taken from the land, taken from their families, thrown into orphanages, and basically have their culture wiped from them. There's a lot of those people that are still alive in Australia, but are marginalised, and they have a very, very difficult life. And because they're been taken away from their land, I mean, I suppose you've got to understand that. But back then, even today, Australia was broken up into, might have been a couple of hundred different countries in Australia, First Nations countries that had their own culture, their own language, and that was all basically stripped away from them. And so basically, new generations from then have had to inherit those problems.
Was that part of the drive in writing this book, is also to share this part of history with people in a way that they could really visualize and be a part of? Because the story really brings you in as if you're part of the story.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that whole idea of silence. I always write about ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, and as I said, whether that be in the Australian outback or on the moors of Yorkshire, I like to give people that didn't have a voice, and I suppose enlighten people as to as we said at the beginning, that part of history that may have been left out. So part of that also goes back to, I suppose, something that happened in my life where I used to be a national football coach, soccer, And I spent 10 years developing this national team called the Pararoos. I even named them when we had an international up in Darwin. And the Australian government decided to basically cancel the program. And so I went public with this, and it was in all the major newspapers, on Channel 10, and to make a long story short, the program was reinstated because I got something like 54,000 people on a change.org, not a survey. What word am I looking for? On a petition. And so they reinstated the program. And then about a year later, and of course, I sort of like lost my job because I went public. And then about a year later, they did a documentary on the Pararoos to try and sort of like to stimulate some more interest in the program and in the players and that type of thing. And even though I'd sort of like spent 10 years of my life sort of like setting up the program, developing players, working for Football Federation Australia, in this documentary, I was completely erased, even though I'd named the team, and my name wasn't even brought up in the documentary, and I was a head coach. So obviously it hurt a little bit, but also I suppose it goes back to how that empathy that I have with First Nations people who weren't allowed to have their say in the Constitution, and how I felt when I was erased from the team's history, basically.
Well, and to dovetail with that, so how can a nation and in many ways examine its memory, especially when it has a habit of erasing parts of it?
Um, I think the responsibility begins with refusing to look away, and accepting the fact that what history tells us may may be shortened and not tell all the facts. And I think it's important not to look away, to sort of like embrace what did happen. And they say that history always repeats itself, but I think it's important for that when it does, we learn from the mistakes of the past.
Well, I can definitely see it repeating itself if it's a piece of history that's never even been addressed or faced.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and there's numerous examples of that throughout the world where it's still going on. Um, you know, Even in sort of like the news that we see on television from day to day, you know, eventually that'll end up in the history books. But how much of that that will be in that history book is true, and what's been left out? What's been left out that future generations won't know about unless they actually don't look away and dig deeper. And I think that's important. And I think personally, I think historical fiction is a good way to, in a non-political way, to look at some of those issues that are hidden.
So, in your view, how does a nation's identity evolve when it's built on exclusion or forced assimilation?
Um, I mean, the gap lies between sort of like uh, invitation and sort of like lived experience. Um, and I think that's one of the important things about Outback Odyssey is, as I mentioned before, um, those sort of allegorical, um, that symbolism that you really need to read between the lines, um, identifies possibly how a nation's morals um, should be shaped or could be shaped. And I think I mean, it's, it, and the same can be said for, as I said before, for any nation that has been colonized and sort of like come into terms with, you know, the effects of that colonization.
What are some of the broader themes of the book that interweave not just this wonderful story that you have, but also how a nation treats its own?
Uh, Couple, some of the people that have read it have sort of like said that they found out so much about Australia that they didn't know because the protagonist Jimmy actually becomes heavily involved with the the First Nations mob. It basically describes the well, it does two things. Firstly, in most novels, First Nations people are basically, just they're sort of like kept in the margins. Whereas in this novel, the First Nations people are actually an integral part of the story and probably the most important part of the story. And it looks at racism. It looks at, as I said, colonization. It looks at Jimmy being the moral engine. He basically is put on trial by that Aboriginal mob. And I suppose if you sort of like read between the lines, that Aboriginal mob is actually putting, non-Indigenous Australians on trial. But as I say, it doesn't preach, and it Jimmy has to face a lot of difficult challenges, and he needs to understand the land, and that's probably the most important thing, is because First Nations people are highly connected to the land and the dreaming and all that type of thing. And yeah, a lot of people have sort of like said, "Wow, you know, I never knew one thing about sort of like First Nations culture or that rich tapestry of Australian culture that very few people know about or talk about."
Can you share with us the migration, the historical migration? Because I think many Americans don't know about that.
Yeah, I think I mentioned that earlier on when I said that about the 10-pound pom. Pom is sort of like a nickname for an Englishman, an Australian nickname for an Englishman that came over um, as a migrant back in the 50s and earlier, um, to basically start a new life. And that sort of like whole trip or journey from England to Australia wasn't as easy as it was portrayed to be. It was obviously, it was after sort of like World War II. There was in England, there was food shortages, housing shortages. Obviously, a lot of men were killed over in World War One, so factories were having difficulty um, getting workers, and people wanted a new life in Australia. But of course, that came with its own set of issues, its own set of problems, and that doesn't even include the whole journey. Back then it used to take 2-3 weeks to travel by boat from England to Australia, and that whole journey on that boat is sort of like another, I suppose, another aspect to the story um, that I suppose gives people an insight into what those early immigrants had to go through. And then we, as a migrant, you had to spend 14, 15 days in a hostel to be tested for various diseases. There was even an instance where and this is actually in the book, but where when they show up at customs, the customs official has to actually read a passage to the immigrant, and the immigrant has to write it down on a piece of paper to prove that they could speak English. So there was all those types of tests, and the hostel wasn't a very welcoming place. There was bitumen floors, and dormitories and fences around with police sort of like on guard and all that type of thing. So and that plus I suppose the seasickness and the uh, you know living in cramped quarters and all that type of thing. So that's a whole new aspect um, to the story.
Most people don't even think about that level of hardship in making a
No.
trip like that. And also, I mean, how can you identify, like, they make all these promises and you get there and it's something completely different?
Yeah, and the thing is that the rule was that if you actually got there, it only cost you £10, but you had to stay for 2 years and you had to go where they sent you. And if you didn't stay for 2 years, then you had to pay back, hundreds of pounds to the Australian government that they paid to get you over there in the first place. And some people were sent to factories. Other people, like my father, he was actually sent out to the outback. I mean, some of these sheep stations, they're the size of England, and very very hot flies, um, and yeah, takes a lot of getting used to. And that first part of the story as a migrant is actually loosely based on my father's journey. So yeah, his name was Jimmy Brown.
Wow, what a journey he took. And that what a different climate from England too. So you arrive and it is nothing like what you left.
No, no. I mean, I remember when I first came to Australia because I came to Australia in the early 80s and I left. I was living in Canada at that time where I went to high school. And I left Canada and it was early December. There was about 2 foot of snow on the ground and flew to Sydney Transit and then up to Townsville and Mackay. And I remember getting off the little plane in Mackay, and it was about 45 degrees. And I mean, I'd never come across heat like that, and it was so dry. It was so dry. So just the climate, as an immigrant, sort of like takes its toll and takes a while to get used to. And it certainly, they say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. It certainly makes you stronger. And I hear people ask me, where I get my knowledge from about the outback and that type of thing. And I actually worked as a navvy for Queensland Railways out in the outback for quite a while. Um, just a navvy's like a worker that moves along a track and basically replaces the old track with new. And we had a mobile camp, and I remember we couldn't have a shower until 6 or 7 o'clock at night. We'd start at 4 in the morning, work through till probably 5. We had to wait till 6 or 7 o'clock at night because the pipes that held the water were basically bubbling, and that's cold water because of the heat on the ground.
Oh my goodness. I can't even understand. I don't think people can really wrap their heads around what that is like and to be back in a time where we don't have all of the luxuries that we do today. It must have been so difficult to be out there.
Yeah, and it was, I mean, there was no air conditioning or anything. We lived in sort of like a metal, what we called a donga, which is sort of like a metal shed, and there'd be sort of like 4 or 5 men living in that metal shed with a paraffin fuel lamp and a wood stove, and that's how we cooked our dinner. And then it was up again at 4 the next morning, and we drive down the track to where we finished the previous night. So, yeah, that sort of like whole frontier life is still occurring now. Although that I believe that they've probably got better facilities and air conditioning and that now. But you still another day you're still out with the flies and the snakes and I remember telling on another interview, I remember telling this guy, he asked me sort of like what it was like, and I said, well, when we had smoko, or sort of like a break, um, you take out your sandwich and put put the sandwich to your mouth, and on the bottom of the sandwich there'd be, without an exaggeration, probably 20 flies on the sandwich. And then if you swipe them away, by the time you got that sandwich back to your mouth, those 20 flies would be back there.
Oh
So
my goodness.
you'd snort a couple of flies every day, and yeah, they go in your mouth, in your eyes, and then of course the brown snakes and that we had to deal with. Yeah,
It's
interesting times.
um that's a way of putting it. It's extremely rugged. I'll say that.
Yeah,
Oh my goodness. And to have a family history of being there, so much earlier, my goodness, I couldn't even imagine just the difficulties and the challenges that were faced.
yeah, and Jimmy Brown. I mean, as I say, the first part of the book is loosely based on his sort of like migration and early days in the outback, and he used to work with Aboriginal stockmen. He used to say that they're reputedly the best stockmen in the world, and he said that some of the things that he saw them do.
I understand fiction can be used as a way of examining national memory, but it
Yeah,
doesn't always resolve it. So
no, it doesn't. No, no, it
yeah,
doesn't.
what are your
And
thoughts around that?
yeah, well, I mean, who like kids in school, reading history books. Where do those history books come from? They come from um, the powers that be, and I think as a nation we're getting a little bit better about accepting um, what was done to First Nations people, and you know, officially we've actually the prime one of the prime ministers a while back actually said sorry, but it was it was actually because he said sorry to the stolen generations that I mentioned before, and he it was a huge fight for him to do that, and obviously through that, there's been a little bit more reconciliation, but not much. There's still Aboriginal groups that are fighting for treaty. There's still a lot of non-Indigenous people fighting for them to have a treaty, and one's just been approved in Victoria. So, I mean, it's 2026, as you can imagine. That's a huge amount of time to have to wait to have your say and to be recognised as uh, as being part of Australia, even when you've been living here for over 60,000 years. So, with regard to your question, yeah, look, it's very, very difficult. It's a very, very difficult situation. Um, People are still debating. People are still fighting. People are still ignoring, and it makes it difficult. And that's, I suppose, through Outback Odyssey, that's what I wanted to. That's sort of like the theme that I wanted to show, to hold up that mirror to to a nation and to other nations who are still having the same issues with in their countries.
Well, it seems that's something that's going on across the board in the world and that we need to really pay attention to. My goodness, Paul, I mean, your book is just such a great read. Where can our listeners go to be part of your community? Of course, purchase Outback Odyssey and to be part, just follow you as a follower.
Okay, so I have a website, paulrushworthbrown.com. Um, no hyphen, and yeah, I'm on social media, and I also run my own podcast, Down Under Interviews, where I interview authors from around the world, and bring their stories to the forefront. And most of those authors are actually American. I had one, and I've got partners in the US and the UK where their platforms actually show or they invite me onto their show to talk about or to show the interviews that I do. So it's called Down Under Interviews. It's on YouTube, Spotify, and it's like a Sunday morning. If you're a reader or a writer, it's a Sunday morning chat with authors from around the world. But mostly my website, paulrushworth-brown.com. It's the best way to get in touch with me.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Marianne, there were some great questions there. I really appreciate your time, and thanks very much for having me on the show.
Well, thank you, Paul. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new novel, Outback Odyssey. Make sure to visit his website at paulrushworthbrown.com for more information on his writings, be part of his community, and listen to his show, Down Under Interviews. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.